Thousands of German farmers are protesting with their farm equipment in Berlin to protest a government plan to get rid of tax breaks for diesel. It would increase their costs significantly and present a major obstacle for, growing food, which humans need to live. So joining us to break this down is one of my favorite political analysts of European politics, is Ralph Scholheimer. He's also a visiting fellow at the MCC Budapest. Thank you so much for joining me. What the heck is going on?
Well, Natalie, great to join you again. It kind of reminds me the first time when I joined you and Clay was talking about the Dutch farmers' protests. And now here we are about the German farmers' protests, which is
Yeah, it's
slightly
almost
different.
like deja vu, and we're both
It is
wearing
like deja vu.
vests. So this is the costume.
Yeah, no,
Let's do it.
let me break it down in two separate issues that help us understand what's going on here. It's different from the Dutch case. In the Dutch case, it was about nitrogen emissions and the use of fertilizer. And as you said correctly in your intro, in the German case, it's about tax policy and the use of diesel. But of course, underlying all of these debates is the same issue, which is that decision makers, politicians, really have no clue where stuff comes from. And this is, I find, is always the most interesting part of this. Like we had the same conversations about energy policy, obviously, as we see whether it's a German policy towards nuclear energy or European and Western sanctions policy towards Russia, which is also an energy question, shows you that they have no idea how energy markets work. And now you see a similar thing in the agricultural market. There apparently really is this belief that food comes from the supermarket and there is no step preceding this. So what's going on in Germany, which makes it such an interesting case, is you have to do a lot to get German farmers in the street. And the current government has pulled it off. And what happened over the last 24 hours was just a prelude. What they have announced is going to happen starting on January 8th unless they scrap all these proposals altogether. So I'm curious to see what's going to happen over the next couple of days.
Okay, well, you're giving them the benefit of the doubt in the fact that they just don't get it. They don't understand, so they make policy that accidentally hurts people. Whereas I might lean towards they know what they're doing and they're purposely hurting the working class because that seems to be the appetite of European politicians. So, do you really think it's ignorance, or do you think it might be more deliberate attack on the working class?
I would say it's maybe a mixture of both, right? I
Okay.
think these two things are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Are there some in, let's say, the permanent bureaucracy who lean towards what you are saying, right, to pursue an ideological program? I think that is very likely. But the actual political leadership, I would say in many cases, they're simply incompetent, which makes it easier for the so-called permanent bureaucracy, or as Trump would say, for the deep state. The problem here that I always see is, as I said, when offered the choice between a deliberate attack on the working class or on, let's say, the pillars of modern life, or these people simply being clueless and incompetent, I always tend to side with the second options. But that doesn't mean that the first option doesn't also play a role. I simply refuse to believe that somebody like the German Minister of Agriculture, that he knows what he was doing, because the suggestions to do, for example, as you said, to do away with these tax breaks came from his ministry, and now he is saying we had nothing to do with this. So it's a very, very, let's say, weird thing. And what makes it even weirder is, did they really expect it would cost German farmers about €1 billion every year? Did they really expect that they would just lay down and take it? It's a very, very absurd thing. Just to give another number, until recently, there were about 500,000, so 500,000 agricultural, what do you call it, agricultural businesses in Germany. Now that number has now shrunk to 250,000. So the agricultural sector in Germany has been under pressure for quite a while, similar to what's going on in the Netherlands and other parts of Europe, right? We see the same in Ireland, where they want to ban cows because of the flatulence. We see the same in France. So this is an event, let's say, that's going on all over the West and all over Europe. This is, and there I agree with you, this is a war on the agricultural sector, which, as so often, is underlined by this idea that the way we eat, the way we consume, that is the true problem and that needs to change. So in this sense, I think you're right. That is deliberate. But I think they entirely underestimate the actual consequences of their policies.
I don't think I know what I would prefer if they were nefarious or ignorant, but you're right. It seems like we've got both. Now, they're saying they need to do this to plug a 17 billion euro hole in the country's budget, but yet at the same time, they're saying they will double next year aid to Ukraine. So, do you think the farmers understand that they're being put at the back of the line?
No, and they shouldn't. They shouldn't for two reasons. Like you mentioned, support for Ukraine, but there's something else going on. Almost 50%, slightly in the urban areas, it's above 50%. But Germany is spending a significant amount of its social security and welfare payments now for people who are not German citizens, and of course, justifiably so. So the people who feed the German population get stuck with the bill for policies that neither they nor the German people actually support. And this is then a set of priorities. It is increasingly the perception, which I think is correct, that the current German government is giving priority to everything except the German people. I mean, I have no other way to describe this. From energy policy to foreign policy to climate policy to agricultural policy to migration policy, the actual desires of the German people, the actual well being of the German people always seems to rank lowest on that list. And more people feel this. And as I said, we can quibble and discuss whether this is deliberate or whether it is incompetence or a combination of the two. But to be quite honest, it doesn't matter. They need to get out of office. This is like, you go to a doctor who's a horrible doctor. I don't care that much if the doctor is horrible on purpose or if he's just an idiot, but you want to switch your doctor. And I think that's the same is true for the German people. This government has to go. And the big problem, and I talked about it with you in the past and with Clay as well, the big problem remains is the media, because they have built kind of a fortress around these either conspiratorial or incompetent politicians. And it's very hard to penetrate them. And I think this is something that we have to work on harder and harder and harder, because they still tell us that those in power are the best of the best. And again, this I would say is a problem from Washington with Joe Biden to Germany with Robert Habeck and Olaf Scholz and Annalena Baerbock, where they still act as if these are brilliant people. And it's just, the population is too dumb to understand how great they are. And I'm not exaggerating here, because if you read the New York Times, they literally write that people just don't understand how well the economy is going. And in Germany, they write the same thing. They say the people just don't understand how brilliant Robert Habeck actually is. And this shows you again on part of the media, they're ideologically so blinded that they really, I think, either believe what they write themselves, or as you say, they are just so tied to their own worldview that they are willing to negate reality to push for their ideological preferences. And I think this is something that we have to stand up against. Like, again, and when I say we, I really mean us.
Right. And so, well, we saw that it cost a lot of this cost other politicians their jobs when they do this. We saw Jacinda Ardern be pushed out. We saw this happen to Mark Rutte. We've talked about this before, how politicians are held accountable for when they choose winners and losers. And the losers they choose are usually the working class. So will there be a fallout then in the next round of elections because the German people understand this?
Well, if we look at current polls, the answer is yes. But I think another issue, and this is something I can only tell you what I hope is going to happen, but I cannot predict with any certainty that it is going to happen. And that is, it will take now the people's courage to really make their voices heard during elections and at the voting booths. Because one issue we had very often in the past as well is people say, oh, I'm so dissatisfied with the government. I'm so dissatisfied with current policies. And then they go to the elections and they vote for the same parties again. Right? The best example was the last time in the United States. You saw it also in Great Britain. People say, I don't really like Joe Biden. I don't really like the Tories. But what alternative is there? Well, actually, there are alternatives. There are alternatives in the Netherlands, in Great Britain, in the United States, everywhere. But people need to have the courage and vote for them. And they must stop. I know this is a harsh thing to say. And they must stop falling for the propaganda from the mainstream media, because that is what it is. I'm very sorry to say this. These are harsh words, and I would have not said the same thing 6 months ago. But they are gaslighting the entire population. The numbers are there, right? Again, from the energy transition to migration to agricultural policy to COVID to lockdowns. The populations of the West have been gaslit on all major issues. We can no longer trust them. I mean, can they earn back our trust? I would say so, but so far I see actually no evidence that they're trying to do so. They try to entrench those who are in power even further. And you see this also on the European level, all these new laws about misinformation and disinformation and malinformation. This is just this absurd idea. Basically, you want to fortify democracy against any change of those who are in power, which is the very opposite of what democracy is supposed to be. The whole point of democracy is that if a government does a bad job, you can vote them out. The new approach is, even if we do a bad job, we have to change the institutions in a way that we can never get out of office again. This is when they say we cannot allow Donald Trump to win. Like, we cannot allow the AfD to win. And the question is, why not? It's the people's choice, not yours. If you really think you're entitled to power, that's the first sign that you have lost any entitlement to power, because that's the least democratic thing, the least democratic position you can ever hold.
Yes. Okay, you said earlier, and I'm curious about this, that it takes a lot to get German farmers out in the street. And I don't know any German farmers. I would like to, if anybody wants to be my friend. Why do you say that? What is this archetype that you're talking about? Somebody who just sort of allows politics to play out and otherwise is salt of the earth. And then they're like, wait a minute. Is that what you mean?
Well, there is. I mean, there was this old saying, and this goes back to the early 20th century, that if Germans go to a demonstration, they first buy a train ticket. And the idea behind this was, or the famous saying of the Steuben parade in New York, that usually the streets are cleaner after the parade than before. So the Germans are not by default a revolutionary people. We saw it historically a couple of times. I always think about 1848. Of course, I'm very old, but not that old. But usually, once the Germans get angry, it's very, very hard to get this under control. And this is what I keep telling also, my more left-leaning friends, is you can try and prevent the AfD, for example, but something is going to come after the AfD. And at this point, I think people are still believing that you can create change within the existing political system, right? You change for you vote for a different party, and they turn the ship around. If they get the feeling that the entire political system has been corrupted, so that democracy itself can no longer make the changes that are necessary, they will turn against the system. And there will be politicians, there will be parties who will support such a change. And I think then we talk about actual quote unquote potential fascism, or potential, let's say, more dictatorial political parties. Because the AfD, Geert Wilders, Donald Trump, Giorgia Meloni, you name them, none of them is a fascist. It's ridiculous. It's demeaning the term, right? It's making light of a very, very serious term and a very serious historical period. But can there be conditions where people say democracy is no longer working, so we need an alternative to the system, and not just an alternative to those who are in power within the system? Yes, absolutely. Which is the reason why I would encourage everyone to vote for these parties and give them a chance. That's how democracy works. You give them a chance. If they fail, well, then we're probably deeper trouble than we thought. But the point in a democracy is that you can vote those out who are in power. And we live now in a world in Western democracies where we have democracy on the surface in appearance, but it's not a real democracy if you're governed by a uniparty system where you cannot distinguish Democrats from Republicans, Tories from Labour, the Greens from the Conservatives in Germany and Austria. If that's the case, right, this is not a democracy. It's a one-party state that appears as being a multi-party state.
Right. Yeah. And I can't imagine things would get worse with a third party at this point. The two parties we've got are making it worse every single day. So I want to ask you one other question. This is not related to the Dutch farmers, but we've been covering the Senate sex scandal that happened in the United States. And I'm curious if the German media has picked this up, because the other person involved in this sex scandal was a German student. The United States media seems very uninterested and uncomfortable with it, because it plays into this narrative that politicians are perverts, which is true. So has the German media expressed any interest in this, given that it was a German exchange student?
I mean, not yet. It might take a little longer until I was about to say until it penetrates the media here, but that's probably
Don't say
the wrong expression. I mean, I was an exchange student in the United States, and I have to say my time over there was apparently significantly less exciting.
Oh, nobody came on to you in a Senate building. I'm
This is
sorry that happened.
but it brings me back. I mean, I'm glad you do mention it, because it brings me back to a point that at least I find so important, which is the people that rule us are clowns. And this, as I said, are there potential people in the background, in the bureaucracy, who are very smart, very scheming, very calculating? Absolutely. But those on top, most of them are, I'm so sorry to say this, but they're incompetent and they're clowns, and it fits exactly what's happening. I mean, at the moment, I'm shocking to say, one of the people who makes most sense in the US Senate is John Fetterman, who had a series of strokes. So we have kind of reached this point in the political discourse where the guy with brain damage makes more sense than anybody else. And this, I think, is a very nice indicator of what a political culture is standing at the moment. But
Yeah. Every day it looks more and more like the Hunger Games, where the politicians in the Capitol have to take morphling in order to not feel the human emotions that they should feel for inflicting pain on other people. And it feels like our politicians absolutely are anesthetized perverts. So
Yeah,
that's what
but
we've
I
got.
think, yeah, but I think one thing is at some point, quote unquote, we the people gave them the power to do so, and I think it is time, by of course by peaceful means. One has to be careful with what one says these days, but to take back that power. And what I mean by this is to be aware that most politicians are opportunists. Most politicians, most have never really done a single day of honest work in their day. It's very absurd for me still. You can enter politics as a middle class individual and leave it as a millionaire. Something's wrong there. When we see this now with the Hunter Biden scandal, all these kind of things, I don't think that Joe Biden is the exception here. It's just that he's now in the spotlight. We know there is insider trading going on from all parties. These are not, would you trust these people with your children? Probably not. Right? Exactly. I mean, they are, and the people know this. If you look at popularity, nobody trusts these politicians. And yet somehow we have this dichotomy of thought that we justifiably so don't trust our politicians. But at the same time, that's more pronounced, I think, in continental Europe than elsewhere. We have this tremendous trust in the state as an institution. So we say those who run the state are all incompetent or against us, but we have to give more power to the state. And I think this is one of the big problems we have currently in the West, is that on the one hand, people want to be liberated from, let's say, a state that dabbles in every issue of their daily life. But at the same time, there is a fear of independence because, of course, the welfare state is comforting, right? It's enervating in a sense because it gives you a certain security, a certain comfort. And to really be kind of put back in a position where you are truly in charge of your own life is something that on the one hand sounds enticing, but of course that also comes with certain risks. And I think this is a little bit the most insidious part of the story of the West at the moment, which is we are in this kind of netherworld at the moment where we don't really know whether we want liberty or we want, cradle to grave state that takes care of every single element of our lives. And I think this is something that we have to decide in elections with the parties we vote for, but that's going to be part of the debate. So to make this point even more succinct is, if the political change comes that many of us are hoping for, that change will have to entail things that are also going to be painful, right? To give you a few examples, the current pension systems are no longer, they are not sustainable. The entire welfare state as it is currently constructed is no longer sustainable. If we want the West kind of to maintain its prosperity, we will have to find a way to play a role in the world, right? That will also entail an active foreign policy. So this idea that many have, you can simply retreat from the world and still be rich and wealthy, is also not going to work. So there are going to be very, very tough decisions to be made, even by the populist parties. So I'm a supporter of the populists for them to get in power. But once you're in power, populism alone is not going to cut it. They will need actual programs. And as we see in Italy with Giorgia Meloni, once they're in power, very quickly they can turn out to be a disappointment. I'm afraid that something similar might happen to Geert Wilders. In many ways, I have to admit that the 4 years of Donald Trump were probably the one example where expectations were overfulfilled. But unfortunately, then he lost in 2020 for numerous reasons that would take too long to get into. But who knows? Maybe he gets a new chance next year.
Now, we do have a template. For many Asian countries have been through some painful reforms in order to pave the way for economic stability and heightened investor interest. So there are templates if we want to study. The problem is the West thinks no one else exists but us. So, but we can talk about that some other time. So thank you so much for this analysis. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. You can find Ralph on Twitter, Scholheimer. It's spelled on the screen, SCHOEL, and then the word hammer. Thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Natalie. Always great to be with you.
Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.